Let me get your perspective on it. You've seen this unfolding. You've seen, from both a local level and a national level. Is there a crisis in law enforcement right now?
Certainly, I think that's probably an understatement. I think law enforcement is dealing with its greatest crisis in morale in arguably 50 or 60 years, certainly in my lifetime, and probably going back to the crises of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Police officers are demoralized. They feel that they have no backing, sometimes within their own community, sometimes within the administration or hierarchy within their own police departments, and sometimes obviously not among their politicians and elected officials either. So it's creating a crisis where the data points that you put up a moment ago perfectly encapsulate the dangers of what's going on today. You have police officers who are demoralized, who are retracting. They're pulling back from the type of proactive police work that doesn't just respond to crime, but actually reduces crime. And the numbers bear out, as you've demonstrated in almost every major city in this country, where police officers are not making those proactive stops. You see violent crime in particular rising. So I don't know what this portends for the law enforcement community in the short or long term, but right now it doesn't look very good.
You know, in every profession, there are those that operate by a different standard, the wrong standard. Law enforcement is not immune from that. I'm sure you saw that in your 20 years in law enforcement. I saw that in my decade plus in law enforcement. But my question is, are there some who are trying to take advantage of this moment to go at law enforcement, not just as individual officers, but literally to disarm our communities from protecting them from, just to be very blunt, the bad guys?
Certainly, and that's not uncommon, obviously, in this sort of political world that we live in, where people will take one incident and try to extrapolate from that to create a moral panic, where people then believe that an entire institution is corrupted, in this case, law enforcement. And that's been the mantra for a number of years now by left-wing activists who seek to tear down the law enforcement community, among other of our institutions here in the United States. It's particularly dangerous because it's a mantra, and these are slogans that people start to take for granted, that they start to believe that they are actually true and accurate without actually questioning the underlying facts behind them. And when it becomes sort of de facto real for a lot of people, you start to see otherwise reasonable people pursue these really extreme ideas and policies like defunding the police that will have extraordinarily damaging impact on our community. So, hopefully people see the bigger picture before going down this road. But as we've seen in some communities, they've already pulled a tremendous amount of resources, money from their law enforcement, and it's had negative impact already.
I want to play a clip of actually a member of Congress, Rashid Tlaib, talking about law enforcement. And this is a concern when you have, in my view, you have elected leaders that are talking this way. Let's play this clip.
You represent a district that has a real crime problem. I'm not sure many of your constituents would not want someone to be there when they picked up the phone to call police.
It's interesting that I'm saying that I'm not saying no one should be there, that I'm not saying that you don't deserve public safety, you do, but try to reimagine what that could look like. Police officers are not the answer.
So how do you reimagine that without police on the streets?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of rhetoric that comes from somebody who's never actually had to engage and deal with the type of crimes that you and I had to deal with when we were police officers, and that 800 or 900,000 cops on the streets have to deal with tonight. The reality is that police work is sometimes messy, it's sometimes dirty, and sometimes very dangerous. And we're asking the men and women of law enforcement to respond to these situations because we as citizens don't want to or are not prepared or equipped to deal with. And so acting like every situation, every conceivable situation can be de-escalated through conversation is unfortunately not reality. And she does herself and she does her constituents a disservice by promoting these false claims and this false narrative, this false idealized world where there are no police, because as you said earlier, that only leads to chaos.
I want to play another clip. This comes from the Detroit Police Chief, James Craig, on what happens when there are no police.
I'll take you back to what we saw last year when some of the angry members of the protests out in Portland demanded that federal agents leave. Many in the city probably believe that after the agents were withdrawn, that there will be no further violence. It only escalated. That's one example. We look at the most recent incident out of Buffalo Center, Minneapolis. The police chief resigned, the involved officer resigned, and the city manager. They too believe possibly there will be no further violence. Violence continued and continues to this day.
I mean, that's a real threat. As we see the defunding of police, we see police backing off, as you described, from, trying to protect themselves out of fear that if they do take action and something goes wrong, their administration, their city officials will not stand behind them. That only creates a vacuum, and something's going to fill it. In this case, it's going to be more crime.
Sure. Everybody, despite all the rhetoric, at the end of the day, if someone's breaking your door in, everybody instinctively calls 911. Nobody instinctively runs to Google to search for social workers to come respond to the scene. We instinctively rely on 911 because we understand that when certain situations happen, you need law enforcement to show up. You need your public safety professionals to show up and provide assistance. So again, it's common sense, and I think most people understand this. It's just that people get caught up in this fever pitch of defund the police. And again, the impact that it could have in the real world if it were to be further advanced is really dangerous. So hopefully cooler heads prevail, and we don't see more cities going down this path of defunding and emasculating their law enforcement.
Scott Erickson, one final question for you. As you look, again, you were at the federal level, you're at the local level, but when you see this trend and what is happening really relatively rapidly, what's taken place last year since the killing of George Floyd, are you concerned that men and women of good character that we would want to see in law enforcement, because of what is unfolding right now, will be turned away from it?
Absolutely. This is anecdotal, but I talk to a lot of my old colleagues in law enforcement, and to a person, every single one of them who has at least 10 or 15 years on has told me they're just riding it out. They're laying low, they're going to try and get to retirement and then get out. And none of them would recommend to their sons or daughters, all good people, to get into this profession in this day and age. It's simply, there's too much risk and liability right now, and too difficult to do a good job, because even when you do the right thing, when your heart is in the right place, because the nature of the work is so tenuous, sometimes you could be put into a very, very volatile situation. So it's a very, very scary prospect that decent, good human beings, good citizens are not going to be entering into the profession of law enforcement in the future, because all of us suffer as a result.
Well, let's pray and work to see that turned around so that does not happen, because that will only make the situation worse. Scott Erickson, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.